Thank you. Have a nice flight.
Thank you.
Dr. Amelia Richardson stood at Gate 12 of San Francisco International Airport, dressed in an impeccably tailored Armani blazer, carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was the chief executive officer of Synergy Tech Solutions, a company valued at $7.3 billion, a company that employed 45,000 people globally, a company whose software powered critical infrastructure across the United States and 73 other countries. Dr. Richardson had built this empire from nothing, starting as a software engineer 23 years ago, rising through the ranks, earning every promotion through brilliance and relentless work. She had just closed a $2 billion acquisition in Tokyo, had saved her company from a hostile takeover 2 years prior, and had been named the most influential CEO in technology by every major business publication. But none of that would matter in the next few seconds. None of her achievements, her power, her $2.3 billion net worth would protect her from the casual racism she was about to experience. Subscribe to Echo Story for stories about powerful women who refuse to accept discrimination no matter their status. Like this video if you believe that corporations must be held accountable for enabling racism. Dr. Richardson adjusted her boarding pass and approached the gate counter, completely unaware that her response to what was about to happen would shake the entire aviation industry. The gate agent's name was Kevin Patterson, a 52-year-old white man who had been working at the airport for 19 years. He had a mediocre job, a mediocre salary, and a deep resentment of people who had achieved more than him. When Dr. Richardson approached the counter to board her first-class flight to New York, Kevin looked up at her, and his expression darkened. He examined her boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, comparing it repeatedly to his manifest. Other passengers, predominantly white, predominantly male, walked past without a second glance. But Dr. Richardson, dressed impeccably, carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and power, was treated as suspicious. Kevin said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "This ticket appears to be fraudulent. You'll need to step aside." Dr. Richardson, her voice calm but unmistakably containing steel, said, "My ticket is legitimate. I have my ID, my business card, my frequent flyer status. What exactly is the problem?" Kevin said dismissively, "That's between you and the supervisor. Step aside." His tone made clear that he didn't believe a black woman could possibly belong in first class, that her presence itself was an error that needed correcting. Dr. Richardson felt something inside her harden. She had experienced racism throughout her career, but she had learned to navigate it, to work around it, to accept it as the cost of breaking through glass ceilings. But this moment was different. This moment would be her last acceptance of casual racism. The gate supervisor, a woman named Linda Chen, approached Dr. Richardson with visible discomfort. She examined the boarding pass and immediately saw that it was legitimate. She said to Kevin, "This is a valid ticket." But Kevin, emboldened by his previous success in intimidating passengers, said, "I don't think she should be boarding. We need to verify her identity." Linda, recognizing what was happening, said to Dr. Richardson, "I sincerely apologize. Your boarding pass is completely valid. Please proceed to board." But Dr. Richardson didn't move. She stood at the gate counter, and she made a decision that would define her legacy and change the aviation industry forever. She pulled out her phone and called her chief financial officer, Jonathan Martinez. She said, without preamble, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it immediately. Contact every CEO of every company that relies on our software. Tell them to issue orders that no company shall use this airline for corporate travel, effective immediately. Tell them to divest all corporate accounts. Tell them I will personally call them and explain why. Do it now." Jonathan, understanding the gravity in Dr. Richardson's voice, said, "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Richardson hung up and looked directly at Kevin. She said, "I just grounded this airline. My company alone spends $340 million annually on airfare. Every company that uses our software will divest. This airline will lose billions of dollars in corporate contracts because you didn't believe a black woman could afford first class." Kevin's face went white. He realized with a terrible clarity that he had just made the worst decision of his life. Passengers in the gate area had recorded the interaction. Within minutes, videos were uploading to social media. The hashtag #CEO Grounds Airline was trending within 15 minutes. News outlets began reporting, "Black CEO grounds airline after gate agent discrimination." The airline's corporate office received the first divestment notice at 10:47 a.m., a Fortune 500 company announcing they were immediately terminating their corporate travel account with the airline, citing discriminatory practices. Between 10:47 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., 47 major corporations announced similar divestments. By end of business day, over 200 corporations had announced they were divesting from the airline, collectively removing over $4.2 billion in annual revenue. The airline's stock price plummeted 17% by market close. Kevin Patterson, watching the news coverage of his own face, his own mistake, began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. He had treated a black woman as suspicious based purely on race. That casual racism had cost an airline billions of dollars in minutes. That casual racism had exposed systemic failures in hiring, training, and accountability. His individual act of racism, when multiplied by a woman with corporate power, had created a tsunami that the entire industry could not ignore. The airline's CEO, Michael Henderson, held an emergency press conference at noon on the day of the incident. His face was pale, his voice shaken. He said, "We sincerely apologize to Dr. Amelia Richardson for the discriminatory treatment she experienced at our gate this morning. What occurred was unacceptable, illegal, and in direct violation of our company values. We are immediately terminating the employment of the gate agent involved and the supervisor who supported his discriminatory behavior. We are immediately implementing comprehensive new training protocols for all employees, including specific modules on racial bias and discrimination, and we are committing $200 million to a fund dedicated to addressing systemic racism in the aviation industry." But the apology, while swift, was too late. The damage had been done. The corporations had made their decision. The market had rendered its judgment. The airline had lost billions of dollars not because of a long pattern of racism, but because one black woman with corporate power had refused to accept it silently and had weaponized the only language corporate America truly understood: money. Within 72 hours, the airline had also announced that Kevin Patterson would be facing criminal charges for discrimination, that a national audit of all hiring and employment practices would be conducted, and that the airline would be implementing the most aggressive diversity initiative in its history. Kevin Patterson sat in a police interrogation room on the afternoon of the incident. He was being questioned about his actions at the gate. The detective, a black woman named Detective Simone Williams, asked him, "Why did you believe Dr. Richardson's ticket was fraudulent?" Kevin said, "It just looked suspicious." Detective Williams pressed, "Why did it look suspicious? What about a first-class ticket look suspicious?" Kevin, trapped, finally said, Because she's black. I didn't think a black person should be in first class." His admission, recorded, was evidence of intentional discrimination. The district attorney would later file charges against Kevin for violating federal civil rights laws. Kevin would face potential prison time, a permanent criminal record, and the knowledge that his casual racism had destroyed his career. But, more importantly, Kevin's admission, recorded and released to the media, became undeniable proof that discrimination in the aviation industry was not unconscious bias. It was intentional, it was systemic, and it was enabled by an industry that had tolerated it for decades. Kevin's confession would become required viewing in every airline's training program, a cautionary tale about what happened when racism met accountability. The FAA announced a comprehensive audit of hiring and employment practices across the entire aviation industry. What they discovered was shocking. Gate agents were not being screened for racial bias. Complaints from passengers of color were being dismissed or minimized. Employees who had engaged in discriminatory behavior were being quietly transferred rather than terminated. The culture of the aviation industry, from hiring to training to accountability, had been designed to protect white employees and enable racism. The audit revealed that Kevin Patterson was not an anomaly but a representative example of systemic failures that had been permitted to flourish. Other gate agents came forward with stories of their own experiences. A Latina gate agent reported being passed over for supervisory positions while less qualified white agents were promoted. A black customer service representative reported being told that she sounded too aggressive when addressing complaints from white passengers. An Asian pilot reported being questioned about his citizenship despite being born in California. The pattern was undeniable. The aviation industry, supposedly governed by strict federal regulations, had been systematically enabling racism for decades. The audit would eventually result in federal sanctions, federal oversight, and mandatory federal training on racial justice for all aviation industry employees. Over the following week, more than 500 corporations announced they were divesting from the airline, but something more significant was happening. Corporations were using their economic power to demand systemic change across the entire aviation industry. They announced that they would not restore corporate travel accounts unless the entire industry implemented comprehensive reforms. They demanded that airlines establish chief diversity officers with actual power and budgets. They demanded that all employees complete mandatory training on racial justice. They demanded that airlines publicly report on hiring, promotion, and disciplinary data disaggregated by race. They demanded accountability mechanisms where discrimination resulted in immediate termination. For the first time, American corporations were collectively using their economic power to demand that an entire industry address systemic racism. The aviation industry, facing an existential crisis, scrambled to respond. Major airlines announced emergency board meetings. Industry groups convened emergency summits. Federal regulators issued emergency directives. The market had spoken, and it had said that systemic racism was not acceptable, not because it was morally wrong, but because it was financially ruinous. Dr. Amelia Richardson had not planned to become a symbol. She had not wanted to be celebrated for standing up to racism. She had simply responded to a moment of discrimination in the way that she had learned to respond throughout her career, with clarity and power. But suddenly she was being treated as a hero, as a symbol of black excellence, as the woman who had single-handedly forced an entire industry to confront its racism. News organizations wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations wanted to honor her. Corporations wanted to celebrate her. But Dr. Richardson, when she gave interviews, was careful to redirect the narrative. She said, "I'm not a hero for refusing to accept discrimination. A hero would be someone who sacrifices something. I used my power and my privilege as a CEO to demand accountability. I didn't sacrifice anything. I simply refused to accept racism silently. The real heroes are the people without power who experience racism every single day and have no platform, no resources, no way to demand accountability. Their fight is harder than mine." Her refusal to accept the hero narrative, her insistence on pointing toward the systemic nature of racism rather than celebrating individual victory, actually deepened her impact. She became not just a symbol of resistance but a model of how powerful people could use their power responsibly, not to celebrate themselves but to expose systemic injustice. But beneath the public narrative of victory, Dr. Richardson was struggling. The media attention was suffocating. Racist hate mail flooded her home and office. People claimed she was being too sensitive, that she should have just accepted the gate agent's apology, that she was playing the race card. Anonymous callers threatened violence against her and her family. She had to hire additional security. She couldn't attend public events without being recognized, without people wanting to discuss the incident, without being simultaneously celebrated and attacked. Her company faced pressure. Some customers wanted to work with her company because of her stance on racism. Others wanted to divest because they perceived her as too activist. Her personal life suffered. Her marriage, already strained, became unsustainable. Her children, who had been protected from racism by wealth and privilege, were suddenly being confronted with its visibility and violence. Dr. Richardson realized that her refusal to accept discrimination silently had a cost that extended beyond her, that affected her family, that required her to make difficult choices about privacy, safety, and peace. She worked with a therapist to process these costs, understanding that justice often required sacrifice, that standing up to systemic racism came at a personal price, that victory in the public sphere could create damage in the private sphere. 6 months after the incident at the gate, Congress passed the Aviation Equity and Accountability Act, legislation establishing federal standards for hiring, training, and accountability in the aviation industry. The bill was inspired directly by Dr. Richardson's case. Senator Patricia Morgan, the bill's primary sponsor, said, "A gate agent decided that a black woman didn't belong in first class. That decision, while individual, revealed systemic failures that had allowed racism to persist for decades. This legislation ensures that discrimination in the aviation industry will not just be unethical, it will be illegal, it will result in termination, and it will trigger federal investigation." The bill was signed into law by the president, who spoke directly about Dr. Richardson's action. Dr. Richardson refused to accept discrimination silently. She used her corporate power to demand accountability. And that refusal changed an industry. But it should not have taken a CEO with billions of dollars to force an industry to address racism. We are passing this legislation to ensure that accountability is built into the system, not dependent on individual acts of courage from people with power. The Aviation Equity and Accountability Act established federal hiring standards, federal training requirements, federal reporting requirements, and federal penalties for discrimination. It transformed the aviation industry from one that tolerated racism to one where racism would trigger immediate federal investigation and likely termination. A documentary filmmaker approached Dr. Richardson about creating a film about the incident and its ripple effects across corporate America and the aviation industry. At first, she declined, but eventually, she agreed, understanding that the story needed to be told, that it could educate others about how systemic racism functioned, about how power could be used for justice, about the costs of fighting for change. The documentary, titled Step Aside, premiered at Sundance Film Festival and was later acquired by Netflix. It featured interviews with Dr. Richardson, with Kevin Patterson, who was remorseful, with the corporate executives who had divested, with FAA investigators, with other victims of discrimination in aviation, and with industry experts on systemic racism. The documentary asked hard questions. Why did it take a CEO with $2.3 billion net worth to force an industry to address racism that had been systemic for decades? What about passengers without power, without resources, without platforms? How many times had they experienced discrimination and been forced to accept it silently? The documentary was nominated for multiple Academy Awards and became required viewing in business schools, in corporate diversity training programs, and in aviation training academies. Dr. Richardson watched the film and saw her moment of principle, transformed into a teaching tool, her anger and defiance preserved for future generations to learn from. 1 year after the incident, Dr. Richardson received a letter from Kevin Patterson. Kevin was no longer working at the Airline. He had been convicted of violating federal civil rights laws and had served 6 months in prison. Since his release, he had been attending college, studying racial justice and systemic racism, working at a nonprofit dedicated to addressing discrimination in employment. The letter was not a request for forgiveness. Instead, Kevin wrote, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I committed a crime when I treated you with suspicion based solely on your race. I spent 6 months in prison, which gave me time to understand deeply what I had done. I grew up hearing that I had to work hard because I was white, that my hard work was being stolen by people of color who got unfair advantages. That narrative made me resent successful black people. It made me see you as stealing something from me. But my resentment was based on a lie that told me your success was somehow my failure. Your refusal to accept my discrimination, your decision to use your power to demand accountability, forced me to see my racism clearly. I'm still doing the work. I don't know if I'll ever fully overcome it. But I wanted you to know that your courage changed me." Dr. Richardson read the letter multiple times. She did not forgive Kevin, but she understood that his journey toward accountability, while incomplete, was meaningful. She sent a brief response. "You're right. Consequences matter. Change requires more than words." keep doing the work. 2. Years after the incident, the aviation industry had undergone measurable transformation. Airlines had hired chief diversity officers with actual power and budgets. Training programs had been completely overhauled to include mandatory modules on racial justice and implicit bias. Hiring practices had been restructured to include screening for racial bias. Reporting systems had been created where employees and passengers could report discrimination without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, accountability mechanisms were in place where discrimination resulted in immediate investigation and, likely, termination. Other industries, watching what had happened in aviation, began examining their own systemic racism. Banks announced new diversity initiatives. Tech companies launched investigations into hiring practices. Retail chains implemented new training on racial justice. Dr. Richardson, though she had not sought the role, had become an unofficial advisor to industry after industry on how to address systemic racism. She established the Richardson Foundation, dedicated to supporting employees of color who had experienced discrimination and to helping corporations implement genuine systemic change. But she was careful never to position herself as having solved racism. She said repeatedly, "I used corporate power in a moment. That's not systemic change. Systemic change requires every institution examining its practices, every individual examining their biases, every leader using their power responsibly. We're at the beginning of that work, not the end." 3 years after the incident at the gate, Dr. Richardson sat for an interview reflecting on what had changed and what hadn't. She acknowledged the victories. An entire industry had been forced to confront systemic racism. Federal legislation had been passed. Thousands of employees had received training on racial justice. But she also acknowledged the limitations. New discrimination persisted in subtler forms. The culture of the aviation industry still struggled with diversity. Racism didn't disappear simply because policies changed. She said, "I grounded an airline because I had the power to do so. But I'm also aware that this was a moment of extraordinary privilege. I had the platform, the wealth, the corporate power to make people listen. Most people experiencing discrimination don't have those resources. The real work is building systems and structures where people without power have recourse, where racism is prevented before it happens, where accountability is built in rather than dependent on individual acts of resistance from powerful people. I did something good. But the system that made my action necessary still needs to be completely reimagined." Her refusal to claim complete victory, her insistence on acknowledging limitations and unfinished work, actually elevated her credibility and impact. She became a model not of someone who had defeated systemic racism, but of someone who understood the magnitude of the work that remained. Dr. Richardson's daughter, Simone, age 24, was completing her MBA at Stanford. She had watched her mother's fight against discrimination at the gate, had seen her stand up and refuse to accept racism silently. Simone said to her mother, "You changed an industry. What are you going to do next?" Dr. Richardson smiled sadly. "I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, running my company, trying to make good decisions, trying to use power responsibly. But you, and people like you, you're the ones who are going to change things. You're going to demand better from the beginning, rather than fighting discrimination as it arises. You're going to build systems where racism is prevented, not just punished after the fact." Simone was indeed building those systems. She was starting a nonprofit dedicated to helping young people of color navigate professional spaces, to coaching them on how to recognize and respond to discrimination, to building networks of support and accountability. She was inspired not just by her mother's moment of refusal at the gate, but by her mother's ongoing commitment to systemic change. The generational moment, a mother who had fought discrimination through her career, a daughter who was building systems to prevent it, captured the complicated reality of progress. 5 years after the incident at Gate 12, Dr. Richardson stood at the same gate counter to board another first-class flight. The gate agent, a young Asian woman, greeted her with respect and professionalism. No questions about her ticket, no suspicion, no racism. The difference was tangible. But as she boarded the aircraft, Dr. Richardson was aware that this moment of safety was not guaranteed. It was the result of policy, training, accountability systems, and federal oversight. Remove those systems, lower vigilance, and the racism would return. She boarded the flight and reflected on what 5 years had brought. Federal legislation, industry transformation, thousands of people trained on racial justice, Kevin Patterson's redemption journey, her own daughter building systems for change. But she also reflected on what remained. Discrimination persisted in subtler forms. The culture of hierarchy and entitlement in the aviation industry still existed. New frontiers of racism emerged as old ones were addressed. She understood that justice was not a destination but a process, that vigilance was required to prevent regression, that every generation would have to fight for the rights they deserved. Subscribe to Echo Story for stories about how corporate power can be used for justice and how systemic change requires both individual courage and collective action. The journey was ongoing. The work was never finished. 5 years after his conviction, Kevin Patterson was working as a trainer for the FAA, teaching aviation employees about racial justice and systemic racism. He had spent 2 years in college after his prison sentence, had earned a degree in social work, and had dedicated his life to undoing the racism that had defined his earlier years. He had also become a cautionary tale, a man whose casual racism had cost an entire airline billions of dollars, whose moment of prejudice had exposed systemic failures, whose conviction had marked him permanently. Kevin was careful never to position himself as having been redeemed, as having overcome his racism. He said in interviews, "I committed a crime. I violated another person's rights based on her race. That crime cost me my career, cost me my freedom, cost me my reputation. I'm spending the rest of my life trying to undo the harm I caused and trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes I did. But I'm also aware that my redemption journey, while valuable, doesn't erase the harm." Dr. Richardson didn't ask for my redemption. The system demanded accountability, and I'm paying that price while also trying to do better. That's what accountability looks like. His refusal to claim complete redemption, his acknowledgement that his journey toward change was ongoing and incomplete, gave him credibility. He became a powerful voice for understanding how systemic racism functioned, how good people could perpetuate it, and how accountability was necessary but insufficient without ongoing consciousness work. 6 years after the incident at the gate, Dr. Richardson's action had inspired a broader reckoning across corporate America. CEOs were examining their own companies' practices. Corporations were asking, how are we enabling racism? What discrimination are we tolerating? Where is power being used irresponsibly? Companies began divesting from industries that tolerated systemic racism. They began demanding that their suppliers, their partners, their contractors address discrimination. The market, driven by the recognition that discrimination was bad for business, had begun to police itself. Dr. Richardson had become an informal advisor to hundreds of corporate leaders on how to implement genuine systemic change. But she was careful to emphasize that individual corporate action, while necessary, was not sufficient. She said, "Every company should do what they can to address racism, but real systemic change requires federal intervention, requires legislation, requires building accountability into the structure itself. We can't depend on individual corporate executives doing the right thing. We need systems where doing the wrong thing is difficult, where discrimination triggers immediate consequences, where racism can't hide." The corporate reckoning that her action inspired was significant, but Dr. Richardson understood its limitations. She worked alongside legislative advocates, civil rights organizations, and grassroots movements to ensure that individual corporate action was paired with systemic policy change. 10 years after the incident at Gate 12, Dr. Amelia Richardson stood at age 60, reflecting on a career that had been defined by breaking barriers and fighting systemic racism. She had grounded an airline that had tried to dismiss her because of her race. That action had sparked federal legislation, industry transformation, corporate reckoning, and personal growth in thousands of people. She had received countless awards, been honored by universities and organizations, been celebrated as a symbol of resistance. But in the quiet moments, she understood that her greatest achievement was not the dramatic moment at the gate, but the ongoing work of building systems where other people without her power, without her resources, without her platform, would be protected from the racism she had experienced. She had stepped back from the active leadership of Synergy Tech, allowing her daughter and a new generation of leaders to take over. She had dedicated the final years of her career to consulting with governments, with international organizations, with corporations on how to address systemic racism. She had also published a memoir titled Step Aside, in which she reflected on her entire journey, not just the moment at the gate, but the decades of fighting discrimination, of breaking through glass ceilings, of learning to use power responsibly. The book became a bestseller and was assigned in university courses on leadership, social justice, and systemic change. Dr. Richardson understood that her story was not unique, that thousands of people experienced discrimination, that many fought back, that some won and many lost. Her victory had been extraordinary only because she had the power to enforce consequences. Her legacy, she hoped, would be inspiring others to fight systemic racism not just through individual acts of courage, but through collective action, through legal and legislative change, through the kind of systemic transformation that would eventually make her story unnecessary. A world where no one needed to be a CEO to demand protection from discrimination, where every person's dignity was protected by law and by culture. That vision remained unrealized. The work continued. The revolution remained unfinished.